Well, hello everybody. Good afternoon from sunny Calgary. We're going to wait a couple minutes here. We're just going to get started. And in the meantime, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping as we usually do here. So as usual, I'm sure you're all familiar with it by now. We do have a chat function at the bottom of the screen. We'd ask everybody that's coming in, let us know where you're calling in from. Let us know what you do, what part of the hydrogen value chain do you belong to. And we'd ask everybody, please keep the comments respectful, which I understand will not be an issue. So next to the chat function, we do have a Q&A button. I believe it's just to the right. And we'd encourage folks to please put in questions throughout the session, and we'll try our best to get our panelists to answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on calgaryhydrogen.ca next week at some point. So let's see where we're at. I see we're already close to 40 people in here. That's wonderful. I see we have Zach calling in from Calgary, Paul from Toronto. Wonderful. Toronto, good to see we have some representation across Canada. So that's great to see everybody here. So while we continue to wait, maybe I'll, talk a little bit about some of the upcoming events. And just to let everybody know, you can follow us on LinkedIn and through our mailing list to really stay up to date with everything. We will be having our Hub Stampede event on July 6th, which I encourage everybody here to please sign up for. It's a great time. In addition, we have another webinar coming up on the AZ project, which is examining some really world-class research out of the Edmonton region that's looking at comparing diesel buses with hydrogen fuel cell with battery electric buses. So I'd encourage folks that are interested in the transit side of things to please register for that. So I see we have some more folks jumping in. Maybe what we'll do now, we'll get started with a land acknowledgement. So the hub is located in the heart of southern Alberta. We acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So I see people are still coming in, which is wonderful. Maybe I'll introduce myself. Most of you folks know me already, but my name is Zach Cunningham, and I lead the Calgary Region Hydrogen Hub. First of all, I want to thank everybody in attendance for taking some time out of their busy days to come and learn a bit about the hydrogen story in the Atlantic. This is another webinar that's going to get outside of Alberta and talk a little bit about the ecosystems that exist elsewhere. So today, we are very lucky to have Derek Estabrook join us to share about the Atlantic hydrogen story. So Derek is the executive director of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance. The AHA is a not-for-profit organization working to develop a thriving low-carbon hydrogen sector in the Atlantic Canada. Prior to joining the AHA, Derek was the Vice President of Business Development at Eastward Energy, where he played a key role in advancing the company's energy transition strategy, including advocating for the use of low-carbon hydrogen to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Nova Scotia. So, a little background. I had the opportunity to connect and meet Derek during the Halifax East Hydrogen Conference this year. It was a fantastic event organized by Wes Scott. And, Derek, I've got to say, Halifax is a wonderful place to visit. I think you are very fortunate to live in such a walkable and wonderful city. And I really hope to have another visit to the Atlantic here soon. And, when we think about here in Alberta, I think we're in a little bit of an echo chamber when it comes to hydrogen. We see the opportunity for hydrogen produced from our very cheap natural gas as certainly the main prize there. And we understand that it makes sense for heavy duty transportation and rail, particularly based on our really cold climate winter services that are required. And we know we need a lot of it here in Alberta for the refining and chemical sector. But certainly myself, I'm not super familiar with the use cases in your part of the world. So I'm really looking forward to learning a bit more about the whole ecosystem. Where do you see, the prize being in the Atlantic, and learning more about all about the Atlantic from you today. So please, Derek, thank you for coming today, and I'm looking forward to you educating all of us. So please feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Zach. Thanks for having me. Let me get my presentation up here. Everyone see my
Yes.
presentation? Yeah, okay. Excellent. So I really appreciate the opportunity today to discuss Atlantic Canada's hydrogen ambitions. And, it's Zach and I had the opportunity to spend time together recently, not only in Atlantic Canada, but also in Alberta a couple of weeks after. And we get talking about the fact that, while there is a lot in common about how the hydrogen sector is developing in each of our regions, in some ways, the landscape and the preferred hydrogen color, green versus blue, and the opportunities and some of the challenges are really distinctly different. And so over the next half an hour or so, I want to walk you through what I think sets Atlantic Canada apart from Alberta and other parts of Canada. So let's get going. As Zach said, we are a not-for-profit industry association. We work closely with the Canadian Hydrogen Association. David Bilodeau, who's the CEO of the CHA, is actually on the board of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance. So while the CHA kind of takes a very kind of national view of the hydrogen sector, the AHA is focused on developing the sector here in Atlantic Canada. Our members really are from across the hydrogen value chain, including hydrogen producers, potential hydrogen end users, academia, utilities, equipment suppliers, government, other NGOs, and service providers. And as you'll see from the logos up here on the screen, while many of our members are based here in Atlantic Canada, we also have members who are based in other parts of Canada or even internationally. Just a really quick geography lesson for anyone who's not familiar with our part of this very big country. Atlantic Canada is comprised of the 4 most eastern provinces in Canada. So that's Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. And we are developing hydrogen projects that target both European export markets as well as domestic hydrogen offtake takers. And I really think that what happens in Western Europe will likely determine Atlantic Canada's hydrogen future, at least in the short term. And that's because Europe already has the hydrogen policies and incentives and crucially, the demand that's needed for rapid hydrogen market development. And meeting that demand isn't just a hydrogen export opportunity for Atlantic Canada, it's also the most likely catalyst for building and scaling a viable domestic hydrogen sector here as well. So, the global energy transition is accelerating, and Western Europe is already building out the infrastructure to support growing hydrogen demand. Like they're building out ports, ammonia crackers, hydrogen pipelines, hydrogen refueling stations. So if anyone here is skeptical about how the hydrogen sector in Europe is going to develop, just go there and see what they're doing. Like they are making these investments in infrastructure because they know they're going to need it. And even if the sector develops a little slower or a little later than we thought it was going to 3 or 4 years ago, it is going to develop. And also in the wake of recent energy shocks, including Russia's continued war in Ukraine and hostilities in Iran, things like energy security and energy resiliency have really become top priorities globally, and especially in Western Europe. And they're looking for stable, reliable, long-term trading partners for both conventional and low carbon energy. And they're looking for partners in places like Atlantic Canada. So this really is Atlantic Canada's hydrogen moment. We think that we're really well positioned to meet Europe's demand for secure low carbon hydrogen because we can leverage 3 important advantages. And first, geography is destiny. Halifax is as close to Rotterdam in the Netherlands as it is to Calgary. And Atlantic Canada has 9 significant ice-free deep-water international ports that give us direct transatlantic access to key European hydrogen markets like Antwerp, Belgium, Amsterdam, Hamburg in Germany, and Rotterdam. We've also got wind. Sometimes we have too much wind. The reality is that onshore and offshore wind is our most abundant natural resource in Atlantic Canada. And while we can't put wind on a ship to send to Europe, we can turn that wind into green hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives that can be sent to Europe. Atlantic Canada's offshore offers one of the best and most accessible wind resources in the whole world. It's strong and it's steady, and we have relatively shallow waters, and we're pretty close to key markets. You may have heard of this project called Wind West, which is proposed to be developed off the coast of Nova Scotia. And this would be Canada's first offshore wind project. In its first phase, it would have around 5 gigawatts of capacity, with the potential to produce over 60 gigawatts, which would be enough electricity to meet over a quarter of Canada's total electricity demand. Also, while Alberta, along with Saskatchewan and northern BC, has been kind of the epicenter of Canada's energy sector for the last several decades, Atlantic Canada also knows energy. Decades of offshore oil and natural gas development and hydropower and oil refining have built up the expertise and the energy infrastructure that translate really well to the hydrogen sector. Of note, the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, that you see on this slide here, is currently the largest producer and user of hydrogen in Canada. And now there is a new center for clean energy emerging in Eastern Canada. And it's really based on wind, both onshore and offshore, hydropower, small modular reactors, all of which are important feedstocks to provide clean electricity to produce green hydrogen. And so now there's even talk of Atlantic Canada becoming an energy superpower. In Atlantic Canada, we're primarily focused on producing green hydrogen through electrolysis, partly because we have an abundance of low-cost renewable electricity, mostly from onshore wind, and we can use that to produce green hydrogen through electrolysis. But we're also focusing on green hydrogen rather than blue because natural gas resources in Atlantic Canada are really limited and expensive. Almost all the natural gas that we use here in Atlantic Canada comes from either Alberta or from the US, and it all is coming a long way through pipelines, which all drives up the cost. So now let me give you the real picture of what's happening with hydrogen projects here in Atlantic Canada. 10 proposed green hydrogen export projects have been announced in Atlantic Canada over the last few years. There are 6 of them here in Newfoundland, 3 in Nova Scotia, and 1 in New Brunswick. 4 of these projects, the ones that I've highlighted here in blue, are advancing toward FID over the next couple of years, while the other 6 have either been paused or are really waiting for stronger signals that significant market demand is developing in Europe. Most of these projects plan to produce and export green hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives like green ammonia or methanol or sustainable aviation fuel. And all of them are planning to use renewable electricity from onshore wind in the short term and potentially from offshore wind in future project phases. It's no surprise that all 10 of these proposed projects are located at or close to major deep water ports. So what I want to do now is highlight the 4 projects that continue to advance ambitiously toward FID. 2 of them are here in Nova Scotia and 2 are in Newfoundland. First, Everwind's Point Tupper project in Nova Scotia is likely the most advanced green hydrogen export project in the region, if not in North America. It's located at an existing bulk fuel storage facility. So you can see here, all of this infrastructure already exists today. The project has already completed its front-end engineering design and it's received full environmental approval. The first phase of this project will produce approximately 240,000 tons of green ammonia each year using onshore wind to generate renewable electricity. And as a sign of confidence, Everwind has already invested about $200 million in this project, and they recently secured about $240 million in private financing to construct the onshore wind farms that they will need for the project. And they're expecting a final investment decision next year. You can see here as well, so this, where you see these blue tanks and the port infrastructure, that all exists today. And this is a rendering of what the electrolyzer facility will look like. Secondly, Nova Sustainable Fuels is a company that's owned by Octopus Energy, which is based in the UK. They are developing a project on Nova Scotia's eastern shore that will combine residual biomass and green hydrogen to produce about 165,000 tons of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, as well as renewable methanol. And they're also developing about a gigawatt of onshore wind power to provide power for their electrolyzers. This project will primarily supply SAF to Europe, and this market is being driven by new regulations that require aircraft that take off or land in Europe to use a blend of 2% SAF starting in 2025. And that will ramp up to 6% in 2030 and to 70% by 2050. They're expecting FID in their project in 2028, and then it'll take about 3 years to build the project. Over in Newfoundland, North Atlantic is developing a green hydrogen hub that includes a 325 megawatt wind farm, an electrolyzer facility, and a hydrogenation plant with the capacity to produce about 60,000 tons of green hydrogen that will be converted to liquid organic hydrogen carriers for export to Europe. And then finally, also in Newfoundland, a company called Estabrook, which is the Exploits Valley Renewable Energy Corporation, is developing a project that will use up to 3.5 gigawatts of renewable wind energy and 150 megawatts of solar power to produce up to 180,000 tons of green hydrogen and 1 million tons of green ammonia annually. So those are the four projects that are advancing quite ambitiously today. While Atlantic Canada's exports projects tend to draw the most attention, we also have some important opportunities to use hydrogen locally here in Atlantic Canada. Like in Alberta or across Canada and globally, the best uses for low carbon hydrogen here in Atlantic Canada will be to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors like heavy transportation. The AHA is working with another Atlantic Canadian organization called Net Zero Atlantic and several industry partners to develop a heavy transportation hydrogen corridor in Nova Scotia. And this project will bring together key players from across the hydrogen value chain, including hydrogen producers, trucking fleet operators, and fueling station owners and research as well, to develop a hydrogen corridor for heavy-duty trucks that will connect the Port of Halifax with one or more industrial facilities in the province that are within about a 2-hour drive of Halifax. And as another example, Halifax Transit, which is the largest transit agency in Atlantic Canada with a fleet of 350 buses, they're planning to transition to a zero emissions bus fleet over the next decade. They have already purchased 60 battery electric buses and have completed a feasibility study for hydrogen fuel cell and hydrogen dual fuel buses. And while it's probably likely that most of their future fleet will be battery electric buses, they have also determined that hydrogen buses offer really important operational advantages over battery electric buses on long and hilly routes, of which there are a lot of in Halifax. And hydrogen buses will play an important role during major power outages, which unfortunately are really frequent here and sometimes last for multiple days. And so in those occasions, battery electric buses may not be able to operate at all. Maybe a unique opportunity in Atlantic Canada and probably in British Columbia as well as is in the shipping sector. So there are, marine vessels are going to be an important, hard to abate sectors. Batteries likely will play a role, but fuel cells and liquid fuels derived from hydrogen, like green ammonia and green methanol, are going to be needed when range and vessel size exceed the capabilities of battery electric technologies. So as an example, there are over 14,000 commercial fishing vessels operating in Atlantic Canada, and most of them have diesel truck engines that are mounted on a hull. And some of these fishing boats, operate close to shore and return to the wharf at the end of the day, and they can probably run on battery electric technologies. But larger vessels that fish further from shore, often for several days at a time, will likely need fuel cells or renewable diesel or another liquid fuel derived from H2. Container ships and bulk carriers are another significant hydrogen opportunity in Atlantic Canada, because green methanol derived from hydrogen is most likely to be the low carbon fuel of the future for the global shipping industry. And so you have major ports like Halifax and St. John, New Brunswick that are eyeing the opportunity to develop green methanol bunkering facilities. There are actually currently over 200 methanol or methanol dual fuel container ships globally that are all already in service or on order. But green methanol supply is severely constrained. So this could be a big opportunity for Atlantic Canadian ports. As another example, there's work underway to evaluate developing a green shipping corridor for iron ore that's exported from Quebec over to Europe. These green corridors are routes on which ships operating on low carbon fuels, like green methanol. And this is a really big opportunity because iron ore is the largest dry bulk commodity in global trade. And the shipping of that ore accounts for about 1/4 of iron mining's carbon footprint. And so this proposed green shipping corridor would include a dedicated fleet of vessels like these, and they would load up with iron ore in Quebec on the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then bunker with green methanol at a port in Atlantic Canada while en route to or from Europe. The Strait also offers an important hydrogen opportunity that could meet both domestic and export markets. Not this strait, but this one. And this is the Strait of Canso in Nova Scotia. And it's emerging as one of Atlantic Canada's premier green energy hubs that will be used to support growing US and Canadian demand for offshore wind, and also for local production of green hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. Geographically, the Strait of Canso is right here. It sits between Cape Breton Island and the mainland of the province. And it's a strategic waterway and a bustling industrial and marine hub. And it's kind of located at the gateway to the North Atlantic. And the two proposed green hydrogen projects that I mentioned here in Nova Scotia are located close by, Everwind Fuels and Nova Sustainable Fuels. So when you look at the Strait, there are several producers and potential users of green hydrogen and derivatives located right here. There is the Everwind Fuels terminal here. Nova Scotia Power has a coal-fired generating plant nearby. There's a large pulp and paper facility here. Cabot Gypsum has a wallboard factory. Martin Marietta operates a gravel mine that actually exports gravel into the US market. There's a marine terminal here. So this is a real sort of industrial hub that that could play a very important role with hydrogen. Another example is St. John, New Brunswick, which is an industrial city that also has significant potential to become a major hydrogen hub. St. John is a port city, and it's home to the Irving Oil Refinery, which I said is the largest producer and user of gray hydrogen in Canada. St. John is also home to several industrial facilities that could be off-takers for significant volumes of hydrogen, and is also home to some industries that produce a lot of biogenic CO2 that could be used to support the production of green methanol or even sustainable aviation fuel. The defense sector may actually be Atlantic Canada's most immediate hydrogen opportunity, and the clock is already running. You may have heard that Canada has announced a major new patrol submarine program that will bring 12 new submarines into service by 2032, and 6 of them will be based here in Halifax. And both of the shortlisted designs for these subs use hydrogen fuel cell-based air-independent propulsion systems that enable the submarines to operate underwater for extended periods of time without detection. And with first delivery of these subs expected within 5 to 7 years, Nova Scotia has a pretty narrow window to develop the whole hydrogen supply chain and the skilled workforce that will be needed to support them. But already there's a company called Cellular Robotics, which is a Canadian company that has a facility in Halifax. They're already making and deploying autonomous underwater vehicles, essentially mini drone submarines, and they leave from Halifax Harbor, and they also operate on hydrogen fuel cell air-independent propulsion systems that give them over 45 days of submerged endurance and a range of about 5,000 kilometers. So let me move on. I've talked about the opportunities, and now I want to get real and highlight the gaps in Atlantic Canada's hydrogen ecosystem that are going to have to be addressed to move projects forward. I think the biggest gap is price. You know, that big price gap is a huge hurdle. Green hydrogen is still expensive, and the market needs customers that are willing to pay enough to make hydrogen projects in Atlantic Canada viable. Secondly, building hydrogen infrastructure from scratch is really complex, and that's no different here than it is in Alberta or other parts of Canada. So unlike electricity or natural gas networks that have existed for decades, or in some cases 100 years or more, we're building the entire hydrogen value chain from production, storage, and distribution all the way through to end uses from the ground up. And that's really difficult, it's expensive, and it is complex. And then one of the third gaps we have is really skepticism. And that skepticism, I think, is real. I think it's real in other parts of the world, and it's certainly true here in Atlantic Canada. Atlantic Canadians remember, LNG projects that were promised and didn't materialize, or offshore natural gas projects that really didn't live up to expectations. So with hydrogen, I think we're going to build trust through delivery, by actually getting shovels in the ground on real projects. I think seeing will be believing. So what happens next to make all of this come to life? I think, to move projects forward over the next couple of years, watch for these 3 signals. First, look for significant demand commitments from Western Europe. Look for signals that interest in hydrogen is being converted to significant bankable offtake agreements through the H2 Global market mechanism. H2 Global is a market-making mechanism that's designed to solve Europe's hydrogen chicken and egg dilemma, where there isn't much hydrogen supply because demand is uncertain, and demand is weak because supply is expensive and also limited. So what H2 Global does is they conduct auctions that bridge the gap between the production cost of low carbon hydrogen and the price that buyers are willing to pay. So using this mechanism, Canada and Germany have committed a total of $600 million to a program that will support the production and export of renewable hydrogen and its derivatives called RFNBOs in Europe. And so the production will happen in Canada and the off-takers will be in Germany. And the $600 million will help close the gap between the price that hydrogen producers in Canada offer and the price that buyers in Germany are willing to pay. So think of this as like a contract for difference. So here's how these double auctions work. Canadian producers of low carbon hydrogen derivatives like green ammonia or methanol will bid for an opportunity to sell to the German companies that offer the highest purchase price. And then through H2 Global, this intermediary called HintCo will run the auction. They will sign long-term purchase contracts with the winning producers and then resell the hydrogen or derivatives to the highest bidders and then use the $600 million in support to fund the price gap. We think this program should support the construction of up to 300 megawatts of electrolysis capacity in Canada, which should be enough to kickstart one or two Canadian hydrogen export projects. And second, look for more tangible shovels in the ground projects and execution. At the recent Hydrogen East conference that Zach attended here in Halifax, participants were asked to recommend near-term priority actions to advance the hydrogen sector in Atlantic Canada. And they strongly advocated for a learn by doing approach and by prioritizing action and execution over more studies and more analysis. And what they told us is that we've got to move beyond the study phase and start developing small, relatively simple, economically viable projects and pilots that are tied to real customers, and then let the infrastructure scale as demand builds. But the challenge, I think, as many of you will know, is that building hydrogen projects is hard because you've got to build the entire hydrogen value chain from scratch simultaneously, and no single project developer realistically can build that whole value chain alone. And that's why projects like the Heavy Transportation Hydrogen Corridor project is important and will be likely an important sort of key flagship first mover domestic project. And this project should kick off soon. And the key deliverable from this project isn't a feasibility study. It will be a business case that investors, owners, and operators from across the hydrogen corridor value chain can use to make their respective investment decisions. And so look to the launch of this corridor project as an important signal that Atlantic Canada's domestic hydrogen market is beginning to develop. And then finally, look for clear federal provincial policy signals. Because hydrogen investors require long-term certainty, and Atlantic Canada really has to signal clearly to investors that it's open for business, that regulatory regimes and standards and codes, will be developed and they will be aligned across all four Atlantic provinces to lower risk and also to accelerate execution. And these kind of clear, stable policy frameworks and faster regulatory decisions are really needed now to attract capital and partners. And that's especially true or especially important in an area like Atlantic Canada, where you have 4 different provinces, potentially with 4 different regulatory regimes, 4 sets of policies, codes, and standards, which is very different than a larger province like Alberta or BC or Quebec, where you have one set of codes and standards for the entire province. So that's it for me. I know we're going to get into some discussion and some questions. I would encourage anyone that has any questions that aren't answered for the remainder of this webinar to get in touch with me directly. You'll see my name and my email address here, and there's a QR code that will take you directly to our website. Zach, back over to you.
Wonderful. Hey, that was a very illuminating presentation. Thank you so much for that, Derek. It always amazes me how, we have such a big and broad country, and things can be so different, right? So there's so many new things for us in our Western Canada echo chamber. So yeah, I have a few questions for you, certainly. You talked a bit about hydrogen derivatives for shipping, long-term shipping. I know we had spoke about this previously and about maybe some of the bunkering, like it's more than just switching the fuels. There's a bit of an economic development opportunity for the Atlantic as well. Are you able to talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Sure. So first I'll say that the entire global shipping industry will transition to low carbon fuels. It's really not a question of if it will happen, but more a matter of when. But also because these large container ships and bulk carriers, they take several years to build, and they have a lifetime of 25 years or more. So the large container shipping companies are already starting to plan for this. But one of the big opportunities here in Atlantic Canada when it comes to bunkering these fuels like methanol is that a container ship, for example, that's running on bunker C oil can literally go halfway around the world before they have to refuel. So if that container ship, bunkers in Amsterdam, for example, it could get all the way over to North America, all the way down to the Gulf Coast, and maybe even up the West Coast before it has to take on fuel again. But with methanol or ammonia, they don't get the same amount of range. So now a ship that takes on methanol in Europe will have to bunker again once it gets to the East Coast. So that's why ports like Halifax and St. John see a real opportunity here. So while we don't do any bunkering today for bunker C, there could be huge opportunity to become an important bunkering port for methanol or potentially ammonia.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting lens when we think of, we think of the capex going into these projects, export focus sounds great for the Atlantic Canada, but yeah, just that little nuance of, the bunkering opportunities and all the economic development that could come from that. It's really interesting. So we have a couple questions coming in here too. So we have a question. Great presentation. Curious what causes the frequent power outages in the Atlantic, and does that have the ability to impact production or offtake agreements in the future?
Oh, really good question. So it's a meteorological question, but also a geology question as well. So fundamentally, most of Atlantic Canada is built on bedrock, which means that most of our power transmission and distribution infrastructure is up on poles. So it's very little of it is underground because it's just so expensive to bury those lines in bedrock. So that combined with the fact that we get a lot of big storms here. We get hurricanes and then other tropical storms in the summer and the fall. We get a lot of really bad snowstorms, and I know in Alberta you get a lot of snow too, but the amount of wind that we get with those storms can be really extreme. And so you combine really strong winds with poles that are above the ground and wires that are above the ground, they come down. And that causes the power outages. One of the realities that we're experiencing now with climate change is that these storms are more severe. They're a lot more frequent. I mean, we went through a phase here where it seemed like every fall for about 4 or 5 years in a row, we had a major hurricane that took out power lines for a really big geographic area for days at a time, like 2, 3, 4 days. And that was very extreme 25 years ago, and now it's becoming very common. So then to address the second part of the question, which I think is an interesting one, is so, first of all, when you think of a green hydrogen production facility in Atlantic Canada, it's as much a wind project as anything else. So you're literally building a wind farm with hundreds of wind turbines, and those turbines are probably located several kilometers away from the electrolyzer facility. So you have transmission lines moving that power from the point of production to the electrolyzer. So it's a yes. I think it's a valid concern that in a major storm they could come down. Now, on the positive side, transmission infrastructure tends to be more resilient. The power lines are constructed differently. They're on these big towers, so it's less likely that they will come down, but it's certainly a possibility.
Wonderful. Again, that's all new stuff to us here in Alberta. So it's really interesting insights. So we're getting lots of questions in here, and maybe I can try to tie a few threads together here. So you mentioned we've got a question about is blue hydrogen getting any momentum or is it just a green story? And then you mentioned geology in your previous comment there. So what about other types of hydrogen? Is there a natural hydrogen story? Is blue hydrogen from natural gas being talked about? Fill us in.
Well, let me start with blue because that's maybe the simpler one. I would say realistically, no. We're just not talking about blue, not because we don't want to. It's just we don't feel we can make the economics work here competitively. Like in Alberta, natural gas is almost free. Like it's a couple of dollars per gigajoule. In Atlantic Canada, it's 10 to $15. So it's almost as cheap to make hydrogen through electrolysis than it is to take gray hydrogen and sequester the CO2. So that's primarily the reason that we're focused on green. Plus, we have all this wind. So, wind power here is relatively inexpensive. But you talked about natural, which I would say like white hydrogen was not on anyone's radar here 12 months ago. And now there are, three major companies doing pretty serious exploration for white or natural hydrogen here because we have the right kind of geology that could be associated with the production of natural hydrogen, kind of at the scale that you need to make it economic, but also in the right places. So, it's got like with natural gas, there's got to be a lot of it available. You've got to be able to find it, and importantly, you've got to be able to extract it at a commercially competitive price. And there's certainly hypotheses or speculation that Atlantic Canada or certain parts of Atlantic Canada, like Nova Scotia and some areas in New Brunswick, might have that type of geology. So there's a lot of exploratory work happening now. And also importantly, one of the reasons why Nova Scotia has become a hotspot is because Nova Scotia has the regulatory framework to allow it. Because in most provinces, they don't really know how do you regulate natural hydrogen. You kind of explore for it, either like it's a mineral, but it isn't, or you explore for it like it's a petroleum product, but it isn't. So in many provinces, you actually can't explore for natural hydrogen because there's no regulatory framework for it. Nova Scotia, however, has been very forward thinking, and we're really promoting natural resource development in the province. So the provincial government has rewritten the regulations to now allow for the exploration and extraction of geological or natural hydrogen under new legislation that's just been developed in the last 6 months or so.
Great. That's a perfect segue into the next question if we're into the
Okay.
regulatory side of things. So we have a question slash comment, very interesting presentation. They say, what is being done to press maritime governments to come together to create a single set of regulations? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start at a bit of a higher level. I had mentioned kind of all the thinking that's happening now in Atlantic Canada to turn Atlantic Canada into an energy superpower, or at least a clean energy superpower. But doing that requires for provincial governments to get their heads together and to work together to develop common policies and regulations and codes and standards. So we've been advocating heavily for that. And we feel that now is the right time to do it. There's a lot of discussion happening in Canada about removing interprovincial barriers. And like that can be hard to do in industries or sectors that have existed for 50 years or more. But this sector is new. So what we're advocating for to each of the four provincial governments is the best way to eliminate an interprovincial trade barrier is to not build that barrier in the first place. So if we're going to have to develop these regulations and codes and standards from scratch, do it collaboratively. They don't have to all be exactly the same, but at least make them common enough so that if a company or an investor wants to come to Atlantic Canada to develop a hydrogen project, they're choosing their location based on the best location for the project, not choosing the location based on where the best sort of regulatory or codes or standards exist. Like make that part simple, because if it's complicated, they'll say, why come to Atlantic Canada at all? I'll just go to Alberta or Ontario and build my project there. So that's what we're advocating for. I'd say provincial governments are listening. I'm hopeful, but I'd also say this isn't the way provincial governments operate. They generally, when it comes to regulations, codes, standards, policies, they develop their own for the needs of their own province. And doing and collaborating with other provinces is not common and not normal, but we live in very uncommon and not normal times. So hopefully, with this sector, we convince them to do it. And I think we can also convince them that it'll be faster and cheaper to develop these regulations, codes, and standards collaboratively than have every province go off on their own.
It's a great point, Derek. And I think, when we're talking about lowering the bar to entry, right? I mean, it seems like just a given that this should not be a big challenge. This should be the last challenge to worry about, right? Is differing regulations between provinces.
Right.
Um, Okay, so I'm going to ask a bit of a spicy question here, Derek, if you don't mind. So, I know folks, when we talk about hydrogen exports from electrolytic hydrogen to Europe, the question comes up, a lot of folks are talking about, round trip efficiencies, all that kind of piece. What would you say to somebody that says, from an efficiency standpoint, it doesn't make sense? What would your rebuttal to that be?
Um, First, I would probably agree with them. So no, that's not a rebuttal, but I would agree. Is it efficient? Not very. However, the reality is that Western Europe anticipates they will have far more demand for low carbon hydrogen than their ability to supply it from within their own borders for a whole variety of reasons. So they're going to need to import it from somewhere. And so the round trip efficiency is science based. And so whether you're producing that hydrogen in North Africa or the Middle East or Atlantic Canada, you've got the same issue to address. So I don't think we're at a competitive disadvantage from that standpoint. It will always be cheaper to produce the hydrogen close to the source of use. And, and Europe will do that to the extent that they can. But when demand exceeds supply and they have to bring it from somewhere else, Atlantic Canada is a very cost-effective place to bring it from. I'll also add to that, though, that the reality is that all the hydrogen that's exported from Atlantic Canada to Europe will be used to decarbonize sectors that we also have to decarbonize in Canada. So if I had a kilogram of hydrogen to sell, I would first want to sell it to a customer right next door. Then not only do you not have to convert it to ammonia or methanol and put it on a ship and export it, uh, they're right beside you. So it's going to be cheaper. So I would also say if Europe can justify the economics of all of that, surely we can in Canada, because that hydrogen is going to be cheaper if we just keep it here.
Great. And I think too, if you talk about these resources, the wind resource that's available, it's going to be untapped or tapped, and
Right.
ultimately, right? Um,
Right.
yeah, and in terms of some of the electricity supply and power prices, we do have a question. So, again, great insights. This attendee commented, and they ask, will hydrogen production in Atlantic Canada strain electricity supply and raise power prices?
Should not if we plan well. In fact, done well, it'll have the opposite effect. And let me explain. So I'll use Nova Scotia as an example. We have an electric grid that peaks at about two and a half gigawatts total. We currently have about 700 megawatts of onshore wind on that grid. And we're planning to add another 1.2 or 1.3 gigawatts. So by 2030, we'll have almost 2 gigawatts of onshore wind on a grid that peaks at 2.5. And the reality is, what that will mean is that there'll be many times a year, especially in the spring and the summer when it's not hot, it's not cold, so we don't need a lot of electricity for either heating or cooling. We might have demand for power that's only 800 or 900 megawatts, and we've got 2 gigawatts of onshore wind power. So on these nice spring and summer days when the wind is blowing, the reality will be, based on the modeling that's been done, that up to 40% of that capacity will be curtailed because there's not enough demand. And I'd say, look, if we're trying to get to net zero, we should never be curtailing renewable power. Like every incremental kilowatt hour is essentially free. So we should let those wind turbines continue to spin, but not force an electrolyzer facility to buy it for $60 or $70 per megawatt hour, because the alternative is they're going to turn that wind turbine off and get nothing for it. So if that electrolyzer operator could buy that surplus power for $20 or $30 per megawatt hour, they benefit because now they can produce hydrogen at a much lower cost. And electric ratepayers benefit because the utility is generating revenue that they otherwise would not generate.
Great, great. That makes sense to me. I think maybe we have time for one more question, Derek, if you have time.
Sure.
We have a comment. Thanks again for the presentation. And how is the industrial background doing in the Atlantic provinces broadly? And the question is more related to the skilled workforce and existing workshops to build these kind of projects. Does that exist today, or does that need to be stood up still?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. And we actually just completed an Atlantic Canada hydrogen supply chain study in partnership with ACOA and the 4 provincial governments to try to identify, like, what is the supply chain needs going to be as the sector develops. And workforce is a huge part of that. And what we identified was that we actually have a lot of the right types of companies and the right types of workers. They just don't know it. So you think of, we have a lot of companies in Atlantic Canada that are servicing the oil and gas sector. So they're making pipes and valves and monitoring equipment, and all of that could be used in the hydrogen sector. They might have to do some specialized training, and the type of materials they use might change a bit, but not fundamentally different. And from a workforce standpoint, I think Albertans will know this. There are, as many Atlantic Canadians in Alberta as there are here. And they're working in the oil and gas industry in Alberta or Saskatchewan or northern BC. And many of them would like to come back to Atlantic Canada. They love Alberta too, but they would like to come home. And So there's a real opportunity for that workforce that's developed, years or decades of skills and experience in the oil and gas sector to come back to Atlantic Canada, take a little bit of specialized training that's specific to the hydrogen sector, and then have a full-time, good-paying career right here. So we think that is a big opportunity, but it's going to take time to get there, and we'll need to start thinking soon about like what kind of specialized training would be required for these workers, and then you need community colleges or universities to be able to provide that training.
Great. Yeah, Ian, there certainly is a lot of folks from Atlantic Canada out in Alberta. In my previous life, working in upstream oil and gas, I had the pleasure to meet many of them. And one thing I can broadly say, fantastic folks. So it's great to have them here, and those skill sets, yeah, certainly seem to be transferable from the oil and gas training. So, um, Derek, I think we've come to the end of our time. Is there anything else you'd like the audience, any final comments or remarks from your end?
No, but it has got me thinking, Zach, we need to do another webinar about Alberta. So you will be my guest, and we'll let Atlantic Canadians hear more about how the hydrogen sector is developing out in Alberta.
I would be honored to. Sign me up anytime. So,
Okay.
um, so that's it, folks. I mean, again, I just want to thank everybody for attending. I saw we had some folks from Finland, from Germany in our webinar today. That's fantastic. We're really happy to have you here. And really a special thank you to Derek. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your knowledge and your time with us and educating us about the Atlantic hydrogen ecosystem. Lots of exciting things happening there. So I'm going to kind of keep an eye on that and look forward to that. So, as I mentioned earlier, our webinar is going to be posted on calgaryhydrogen.ca. We're going to have our Stampede event happening July 6th. In addition, next week, I neglected to mention, we're going to be having a Hyundai Exient truck in Calgary for the first of a kind at the Mayor's Environmental Expo. So, if you're downtown Calgary, get in touch, come visit us and come say hi and come check out the Hyundai truck. So, with that, thank you very much, Derek.
Thank you, Zach. This was fun. Really appreciated the opportunity.
Awesome. Take care, folks.
Okay. Bye.